guys have worked with Selenium before, use Selenium actively every day? So like, okay, pretty good number. How many of you are looking to start Selenium, trying to figure out if it's a good fit for your company? So another handful. Okay, so that's perfect. This is right, kind of who I was targeting, who I wanted to talk to. First, my name's Jared Yarn. I also work at Lucid Software, just like the last presenter who was in here. I figured I'd show you guys a little bit so you could get a picture of what we're working on. This is our docs list for Lucid Press, one of our products. It's kind of like, we refer to it as Google Docs, but Microsoft Publisher version of it. So it's for a design and layout tool. So for those of you who have worked with Selenium before, this might mean something to you. That center area is all one DOM element. So it's not like there's a lot of DOM manipulation we could do there. So we have to use a lot with the actions class and various parts of the driver in order to be able to work with that. Our flagship product, the docs look most of the same. This is Lucid Chart. It's a charting software, and it has right now about 21, 22 different floor plans. And here's just an example of one of the different plugins that I use. This is a floor plan plugin as we were getting ready to move into a new house, so figuring out the design and layout for it. But it's also used, people use it for flow charting, organization charts, and that's kind of the software that we work with, and I work predominantly testing and working with Selenium. So with that, I'll go ahead and begin with Selenium testing, 7 things you need to know. Again, Andy talked a lot about our unit tests and our integration tests. With Selenium, we're specifically talking about end-to-end testing. So testing a flow from an application from start to finish. You'll notice at the top of this is at the top of the triangle. But something that it's important to remember, we're not trying to test every little thing with Selenium. We're trying to really just take, our approach has been to just take the happy path, make sure the site's up and running, make sure all the various features work, not trying to test a lot of very intricate cases. Some background where we're at with Lucid's end-to-end testings. All developers are responsible for writing their own tests. As a result, since Andy started about 2.5 years ago, he was the one who actually wrote the first Selenium test we used. And since then, we've had about 40 developers follow suit. We're up to about 700 tests, and that's doubled in the last 6 months. Also in the last 6 months, we went from about 20% false negatives to getting less than 1%. I know that was a question during the last session in here, was Selenium being brittle and getting a lot of false negatives, having a lot of problems. So that's something we're pretty proud of. We were having a lot of issues, and we're able to figure out how to resolve that. That's some of the things that we'll address. And then also, we used to have a full-time engineer dedicated just to maintaining the test, trying to keep them up to date. And with some of the things we've done, we've been able to reduce that time to about 5 hours a week. Just a little story about where we were. I know Andy mentioned ignoring tests. He said that's one of the best ways you can make sure that your developers aren't going to write anymore is by completely ignoring their results. So when I came on, it was about a year ago. I remember about 3 months in, I saw Selenium, saw a little bit in there, figured I'd play with it a little bit, wrote a test, and then about 2 months later, someone came back to me and was like, hey, Jared, there's this bug. Didn't you write this feature? And I was like, yes, I wrote the feature, and I wrote a test for it. There's no way that bug should be in production. We wrote a test, and so then we turned to the guy who was supposed to be monitoring the test, and he said, oh, that test, it started failing. It was failing intermittently. It would fail sometimes and pass other times, so I put it on the blacklist, and we stopped running it. And that was just a surefire way to make sure that no developers want to write tests again, and to make sure that all the time you spent writing tests is an absolute waste. So I would not recommend that. That's kind of what piqued my interest. Was it started with, hey, this should not have made it into production. It did, and obviously there's a flaw in the system. We need to fix it. So that's what I've spent the last 6-9 months doing, is focusing heavily on that system. Mostly just on top of normal dev stuff, just trying to really get down that number of false negatives and make our tests as reliable as possible. So just while we're still starting off, some pros and cons. Selenium testing, better code coverage, and it actually represents user scenarios. Some of the cons, it tends to produce false negatives. It can be more difficult to maintain. Who here's ever had trouble maintaining their Selenium suite? Find it a pain, have to go and fix tests. Developers break them and they have no idea why. They change something and don't tell you. There's all sorts of different reasons that can make Selenium tests really difficult to maintain. A single bug causes many failures. Someone pushes a bad build and logging in is broken. All of a sudden your entire Selenium suite fails because no one can log into your product, and you get absolutely no good data from that other than there's one bug, you can't log in. It requires a full stack. It's not something that could necessarily be run every build unless you have extreme parallelization. And there's a longer feedback loop because of that. Ours at our company is typically about a day. If you push code on Monday morning and it breaks a Selenium test, you'll find out Tuesday morning, which is a lot better than finding out 2 months down the road when it's in production. So today we're going to focus specifically on producing false negatives and how difficult they are to maintain, and things that we could do as QA engineers or anybody writing tests to help try and cut back on both of those to really make Selenium a powerful tool in your testing arsenal. The first, producing false negatives, as we started to address that 20%, those tests that were failing, and then the 55 tests that were blacklisted because they failed intermittently, the biggest issue that we faced was timing issues. Elements change visibility. You click on a block and we change the entire option bar. And we all know you're running Selenium and it says, hey, click on this block and then click on something else that's supposed to have appeared and it hasn't appeared yet. And we've all ran into that issue. The test fails, but it was it wasn't actually that the code broke, it was just that it was a test failure. Or running against different environments. I know we run some of them against our production environment, against our staging environment. So sometimes the page loads a little slower, and as a result, the entire test fails because what it's expecting to be there isn't there. And specifically for us, since we do a lot of actions and a lot of things across the viewport, that center area where all the drawing occurs, if an action doesn't complete, like you add a fill color to something, and then you go to check and see if the fill color is there, but it hasn't been applied yet, just because of the JavaScript being a little slow, Selenium being extra fast. We get those timing issues and we get these weird intermittent tests, and you look at it and say, there's no way that should have failed. It's working fine. I can't reproduce it by hand. So addressing a lot of those issues. The next one is difficulty to maintain. Like I said, we have 40 different developers who have written Selenium tests, and everybody codes a little differently. In the WebDriver, there's 16 ways to find an element. There's also, in our product, 5 ways to create a new document and 8 ways to open a publish dialog, just to name a couple of examples. And as a result, if all of those are used differently in different places, when one of the paths breaks, you don't know what test to go and fix. You don't know which ones to change. So working on making it so that there's a solid framework in place for people to kind of follow. The other one is the product's always changing. We're currently running 22 different A/B tests between both of our products. And with that, there's just a lot of going on. There's a lot of new features and new development. And just frankly, the DOM changes. Like, we're always trying to update and make things look better. And as a result, that could break a lot of your Selenium test. All your hard work you put in, you made it looks good. And then with one simple change, all of a sudden you have to go and find new IDs, find everything else, and what you're actually trying to test and move your tests through. So with that in mind, this presentation's goal is to address 3 different goals. Make the test easy to write. So make it easy to write for all our developers so that they can kind of know what it is how to write the tests, where it is, making it less of a pain. I know the biggest reason when we ask people why they weren't writing tests is because it takes too long. How many of you guys have had developers or other people at the organization say it's just too hard to write tests? I don't feel like it. It's too long. It's a problem we all have. The other one is making them easy to update, making them maintainable. I know when I talk to people about Selenium, they say, I've heard companies spending as much as a whole team, 4 or 5 dedicated developers just to try and maintain their suite, keep it up to date with their changes. It's something we're able to do. Granted, our suite may not be as big as them with basically a part-time developer, 5-6 hours a week, and then making the tests more reliable, making them so we're not getting all those false negatives everywhere, and trying to figure out like what's the best way we could get these so that when a test fails, we could be confident enough that we don't need to rerun it and see why it failed, but we could just ship it out to a developer and the commit who broke it and say, hey, this test is failing. So with making tests easy to write, there are two things we did, and these actually both were kind of came from Andy, and things that we started doing was create an application user, and then we also rolled our own driver on top of the remote web driver to try and put in some helper methods and make it easier on our developers. With the application user, for us it's a Lucid user, Lucid Software. The big thing this one contains is it's going to contain all the access to the backend services and also like setups, things that developers are going to do over and over again to get to a particular start of a scenario. For us, that could be logging in and getting to the docs list. It could be setting up a team account. It could be creating a new document and just getting to a blank, fresh document. These things that are repeated over and over and over in hundreds of tests, pulling that out into the user so you could just start with something as simple as create a new user, and I want it to be on the docs list, and I want it to be a professional user with that subscription with 3 fonts uploaded, and really making it simple so that you could drop any developer, all 40, 45 of them, right into our the scenario that they want to test. And we've done a lot of honing on these particular scenarios to set them up so that we know we're not getting failures in these early scenarios. These are that case that we talked about where a single failure, if someone actually breaks something in creating a document or in one of our backend services to create a new user, it will fail all the tests. But the main goal of this was to make it much easier on our developers to write. So by making it easy for them to write, we've helped encourage them to write more tests. The other part, like I said, is our Lucid driver. So with the Lucid driver, it contains the web driver. It's on top of the web driver. We've also added our actions class to it. So like I said, we use a lot with the Selenium Actions. So things like drag and drop, executing a script, particularly like clicking a web element or double clicking on a web element. I know the web driver provides a strong interface for getting the web element. So all of these are pretty simple methods, but it's a lot that it takes the burden off of the developer, off the person writing the test, and makes the methods what we feel is a lot more explicit. So just things like this, like the double clicking or context clicking, it's as simple as just go and get the element from WebDriver and then do the actual click on it. So there's a lot of things like that where developers complain that they just didn't want to go look in the WebDriver API. They didn't want to go look in the web element API. Like all of that was just extra overhead that they had to do again and again with every test. And it was one of those things that we didn't really need all 50 of our developers to be familiar with all the intricacies of the WebDriver and Actions class and all these different things. So we've tried to narrow it down to the bare minimum, the things people are going to use most often in their tests, and really build out helper functions for them. These two things alone, we did these two, we introduced it to people, talked a little bit about how to write Selenium tests, why it was important, the types of things to test with Selenium, and within the next about 2 months, we had written about 100 more tests. So in the first 2 years, we'd written about 300 tests. In the next 2 months after that, we wrote about another 100. So it really helped get the fire in our developers. It answered a lot of their questions and made it easy on them to be able to write these tests. So again, this is all about making tests easy to write. So making it so that anybody in our organization is able to come in, write the tests, understand them, and kind of with the goal in mind is we have some people on our QA team who are more so manual testers. We want to make it easy enough that even though they don't have any coding experience, could learn and pick it up pretty easily and be able to write the tests and design the scenarios with little to no help from some of our developers. The next goal, making tests easy to update. like I said, we've all dealt a little bit with having tests that are frail, having tests that break often. For us, we switched to the page object model, which is really huge for us. Like I said, most of our product is based on 2 pages. Granted, those pages are fairly complex. Who else here heard of like the page object model, have kind of an idea? So about half. If you haven't, I highly recommend going and looking a little bit up. On Saturday, there's going to be a tutorial on how to write your tests in the page object model. I'll go into it briefly here, but it's something that's really changed how we write tests. So for us, here's just a picture of our docs list. We break it down into like the main menu, the file tree, the file browser, the different panels that are there and available. And instead of relying on the developer when they're writing a test, for example, for the file browser to be able to click on a document, instead of relying on the developer to have to go and find the ID and figure out exactly how to click on it and set it up and then perform an action over here on the action panel, instead we've built objects within the Selenium within our Selenium framework that know all of these things about themselves. The file browser knows how to count how many documents are on the browser. It knows how to collect the first document. It knows how to click the new document or the add document from template. The sharing panel knows how to open the share dialog and how to actually share a document. And because of this, we were able to get rid of a ton of code duplication. Like, we cut the size of our Selenium test while maintaining all the functionality that we had before almost in half just by moving to this model, and again, it's another thing that really made our developers love it. So here's an example of a page object. Like, our docs list has an action panel, a file browser, a file tree, a sharing panel, and an invitation panel. And then these are methods from within the file browser. It has like the click create document or select a document or check how many documents there are. So various things like that. And these were some of the most common functions we had throughout our entire product. And in variations, they were listed in almost 100 different tests. So if someone changed one thing, we had to go to 100 different tests, update 100 tests, and it was terrible and miserable, as I'm sure many of you have felt before when you have to go and do something like that. And it also made the tests much cleaner and easier to read. Instead of having this over here with, you see this developer chose to use some deprecated methods. We have a random 5000 there in the middle. Some of the CSS isn't very clear what you're actually clicking on. Instead, the test looks something like this. You just go and you create the user, log in, go and ask the doc list, hey, close the triptych. Hey, go and click the create document, and now check is the template chooser visible. Okay, click the start drawing, and then make sure that a document appeared. So it was really able to simplify it, and this was probably the big thing that helped developers we have that aren't necessarily haven't been coding for a long time, or our QA people who come in with no coding experience, to be able to write these tests. It was something that was very intuitive to them. It made sense, and yes, it took some time to build out the back end, but it's been worth it. It's allowed us to scale our tests exponentially. Where we had about, so we have a checklist of, it used to be about 800 items that every time we got ready to release, we had 5 manual testers go through, and they manually went through and checked all 800 of these items to make sure things were going, and some of them contained 12, 15 different scenarios. And as you can imagine, that took 3 or 4 days. Obviously, not the answer, something we're trying to get away from. And with this, they were able to, so far, within about the last month, we've automated 130 of those tasks and have a goal by the end of the quarter to automate another 400 of them to cut down that time they were spending from 4 full days, a full week, before we could call the regression complete by our manual testers, cutting that down to hopefully 1 day, which, as you can imagine, gives a lot faster feedback loop as to whether we're ready to release or not. So the other point, DOM IDs, getting your developers, when they create new elements, when they add something to the page, to include IDs. How many of you had to go in before and find somewhere and add an ID to it? You guys have to do that very often. I know I do. I have to go in, and then I go and smack the developer on the head and said, why couldn't you put an ID on this? Because the only other way to identify it is 6 or 7 classes deep, and it could be fairly complex. So here's an example on the top of something we used to have. As you can tell, it's very readable, and you know exactly what they're clicking on. So that test was really easy to debug when it broke, and you knew exactly what changed and what happened. When you use IDs, you can get something like this instead. It's much clearer, much more easy to use. I can't stress that enough. If it is a problem you're having within your organization, I would highly recommend it. It's easy to do. They're easy to add. Get your developers as they're adding to it and adding to the DOM to put IDs on everything that are clear and descriptive and understandable. It'll make testing a world of easier to understand, to debug. So here's an example of something we had. We recently, our design team came and said, hey, we have a new design for this is our publishing dialog from Lucid Press. And this is what it used to be on the left. This is what it was on the right. And as you can imagine, you look at this and you think, well, we had a dozen tests around this dialog before. We're going to have to rewrite all of those because we have a brand new dialog. It looks completely different. Although most of the functionality is preserved, we're going to have to go and find all those IDs, find all the DOM elements, and figure it out. By using DOM IDs, we were able to make this into it took us maybe an hour to port all 12 of those tests, just because most of the buttons stayed the same. So all the actual clicking and working with the dialog was already taken care of. All we had to do was change how we navigated to it. And once we got there, the test already knew exactly what to do and was able to function and run just fine. So that was our huge success, and that's our example we use to all our developers when they don't write IDs to help them. Tell them that if they don't, they'll be the guys who have to come and rewrite all these tests. So again, making tests easy to update. The page object model, I can't stress enough how valuable that was to us. It really changed how people around the organization saw Selenium tests. It's no longer something that's a pain to write. It's something that is relatively easy. They could add in 30 to 40 minutes at the end of a feature, as opposed to taking an hour, 2 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours, depending on the test and the scenarios they wanted to run. And then with the DOM IDs, it's there for you. That's why it's there. Take advantage of it. Making tests reliable. Like I said, this was a big question that came up last time. I don't know if we have the best solution for it, but I will share with you the solution we do have. It's worked, and so because it's worked, we haven't really tried other things. We tried some other things before, and they didn't work as well. This is one that we found that has worked, and we use the two different things, action retries and SweetRetries. So for action retries, here's the basic idea of it is we default it to about 3 seconds, and polling every 50 milliseconds, it just keeps trying to do something until it doesn't throw an exception. So you could actually do it or it times out. Not the best solution. Every time we look at this, we see polling and it's terrible. It's something that we decided that we were okay with our Selenium suite because we cared more about the functionality and the test working than about all the timing and the things like that. For timing and performance, we have separate tests for our load and performance testing. We'll know if things are taking longer than they should. But as far as our Selenium test, we wanted to be able to test these happy flows without having to dig through hours and hours of false negatives every week. So this is broken up into, we basically summed it up in 3 things that our developers are going to need to do. The first is a get with retry. Go and either get an element, get text off an element, get a string, some sort of thing like that. So here's a couple of examples. You just wrap it in a get with retry. Go and figure out how many children are on this, whatever's visible in the CSS. And then same with the document title. Go get this document, get the particular document out of the list of documents that we gave back, and get the text off of it. And keep trying until you actually get some text. If we don't get text after 3 seconds, we know there's an issue. We're able to come and look at it. We know it should not take longer than 3 seconds, and then those are also configurable if people need to change the time on it. The next one's very similar. It's a do with retry. This is a good example is our fill color well. When you select a block, the fill color well comes up in the option bar. It's not there while you have nothing selected. So if Selenium occasionally would try and click too fast after selecting an item, and it would click, and then the color well wouldn't be there, and we get an error, and it would come back and say, hey, the test failed. Instead, we just wrapped it with a do with retry. I know we tried some other things that WebDriver has built in and found limited success with it, and that's kind of why we decided to do something like this ourselves over this one. The last one is a predicate with retry for like asserts. So even if it returns, doesn't throw an error, if it returns a false, then we're going to go and try again. And if it returns a false, we're going to keep trying until we get a true answer or it times out. So here's an example like that. The user driver, the current URL contains the URL we're expecting. I know sometimes it'll go to like a data URL and it would return that and say the current URL is a data URL. It doesn't contain the actual URL of what you're trying to get to. And as a result, we get another failed test, get a false positive, or a false negative. And so, while I said this may not be the best solution, we have these wrapped all over the place. We've managed to move it away from our developers into the page objects so that it's not something you see in every test. As you're writing tests, it's not something you need to worry about. The pages know things that move in and out, things that animate, things that we're going to need to do this retry and pause on. And as a result, it's all kind of hidden back a little, abstracted a layer back onto the page objects. So the next one is SweetRetries. How many show of hands have implemented some sort of retry on your Selenium test before? Couple, few people. I know it's something that when we were dealing with all these false positives, it was something I looked at and just said, why can't we just run them all 5 times and then figure out if they're going to pass or not? Obviously, that's not feasible for us. That turns a 3-hour test suite into a 15-hour test suite. But we did develop the SweetRetries. We use Scala test framework, so built in with SBT to run all our tests. So this is just an example of one way we were able to do it. We capture all the reporting of failures, hide them until we get a success, or 5 times. If it fails 5 times, the test is probably actually bad. But like I said, this really is only a last resort. We have 135 different suites. We only use it in 7 of them. We had it in more. We've slowly taken them out as we've worked on the tests and tried to get them more reliable. The ones we do have them in are things like image uploading. We go out to Google, we ask for an image and upload it. Occasionally we get an image that's really big. It takes longer than we expect. As a result, the test fails. Thumbnail generation, we use an external service to generate thumbnails. And same with, we have Google Drive integrations and syncing with Google Drive, where all your documents in our docs list could show up in your Google Drive docs list. And so our tests around those, sometimes just the response between us and Google is a little slow in sending out those external requests and getting everything set up. So those are the types of things we retry. We tried to limit it only to things that are external. Occasionally, as a feature's like in development and we're writing the test and we're writing new page objects for it, we'll put this on. But typically we try and reserve it for just there. And those were the 2 things that really made a difference in making our test reliable. Like I said at the beginning, we had about 20% false negatives. We got it down to less than 1%, which has been really phenomenal. It's really eased the load on me and the other guy who looks at the test and reports to people. So that's been really phenomenal. So the last point I wanted to make is Selenium's a powerful tool. It's awesome. Someone brought it up last session that is Selenium something a lot of companies hear and shy away from. They say the tests are brittle, they're flaky, they're a pain to use, they're difficult to develop, they take too much time. And while I agree with a lot of those things, and unit tests and integration tests are always better to have. They're going to run faster. They're going to be in a better place. Selenium can be a really powerful tool. have fun with it. We've done some awesome things, like some screenshot comparison of specifically just the viewport that we have, because we do all our own rendering. It's just really one big canvas. We render it all ourselves. So being able to test our rendering through viewport screenshot comparison. I mentioned earlier Google Drive integrations. So we actually have a test that will deploy our app and set it up on Google Drive and then test the integrations with it, which has been really phenomenal. One of my favorite just to watch is we have multi-user collaboration. So it'll spin up 8 or 10 different browsers and have all these browsers working on a single document together and chatting and working together to test all our collaboration features. And it's really awesome to see, awesome to do. So Selenium can be powerful. You could have a lot of fun with it. So to recap, 7 things that we did that really helped our Selenium suite, made it more powerful, was develop an application user, give yourself access to the back end, and understand how to set up all the tests. Customize the driver for the functions you're going to use the most often. Those, I can't tell you how big of a lifesaver that is. Just being able to, it looks simple. You're writing all these methods that are only 2 or 3 lines, but when it comes time, you have a method that's called click, and you give it a CSS element as opposed to having to go and get it and click it. It's been really good for our developers. Use the page object model. Page objects. At first, I wasn't a huge believer. We started doing it, and I was kind of like, okay, this is a lot of work. There's a lot. We do a lot of stuff on our website. There are tons and tons of actions. How are we going to build all this out? But in the end, it's worth it. If you're planning on scaling your suite, that is something to do absolutely 100%. I know I'm going to the talk on Saturday, the tutorial on how to do it, to try and hopefully learn some more. If it's something you haven't done or something you're working on, I'd highly recommend it. Next one, use DOM IDs. Get your developers to use DOM IDs. Don't try and use XPaths and classes and things that are going to change with every iteration of the product. Set up retries on individual actions. Set up retries on suites. Both of those will help cut down on false positives. They may not be the best solution, but they are a solution that cuts down on false positives. And in the end, if it's saving the company time because you're not having to sit there and rerun tests and figure out why this test failed this one time and it passes every other time, it's worth it. And finally, have fun with it. It's a powerful tool. It's really enjoyable. I hope you could tell that I really love what I do. It's something that I had to fight tooth and nail with at the company because they hear testing and they hear that it's not something going to a product. It's not something going into the product. It's not something the users are going to see. So convincing the business team that it was a worthwhile position and something we should invest in. And it's proven its dividends. We catch regressions almost every night based on it. So with that said, are there any questions? How do we handle sessions? You know, a lot of that was built before I started. But basically we do it with just logging in. Like, are you talking about individual sessions with our product? Yeah. So we create a user. We're working on right now in that user class being able to just start a session by just dropping it into the database and say, hey, there's a session started. Right now we just have, they all go to the login page and log in first. So not the best solution. Adds 5-7 seconds on every test, but it's what was there when we started. So it's high on our list of things to change.
Can you start with passwords locally for them?
So what we do is we just go straight directly to our user client and create a brand new user every time. And it just drops in. It's like Lucid test user with a random UUID and then a random password of like 8 to 10 characters.
So your admin user to do that?
Well, because it's all run locally, so these are obviously different than our production. For our production, we just have a small suite of tests that run on one particular user that logs in and out every time. For our local ones, since you have access to the database and the client and can create users and delete them at will, we just go directly to the client, create the users, and then at the end of the test, as part of the cleanup, it just goes and obliterates it from the database.
Not a question, but a comment on a test retry. A failing test could be a result of a race condition. for example, Ajax race. If you have two Ajax actions and if you have different results, if one happens ahead of the other, and it is possible, because they are synced, for one to happen ahead of the other. So that should be an indication of a bug in the code that depends on the timing of actions on the back end. And so another thought on what you could do on the action retry, maybe you already have that coded, but the way I approach this problem is slightly different. It is, in order to be able to do the next action, what's my assumption? My assumption is that this element has to be present. So I'm going to add an assert. I'm going to wait for that element to be present. And then, when timeout, error out, if I can don't catch it. And then, once I know it's there, I'm going to click.
Yeah. So that is something that we've stressed in our tests. All of them do follow that pattern where you click a button and then you say this is supposed to happen, so you assert like the pop-up came up that was supposed to come up. A problem we run into in particular with like the option bars is all the elements are there. Some of them are just hidden, some of them are hidden different ways, some of them are just disabled, and different things like that. And so a big one we used to get was stale element exception, where it thought it was on the page when it got the element, and by the time it went to go and actually click it, it was now off the page again. And as a result, that's kind of where that bred from. But I understand exactly what you're saying. I do highly agree with that. You should be asserting every time you do an action, it should be followed with an assert of what needs to happen before the next action can be performed. So, any other questions?
You put your asserts in the page objects or in the test?
They're in the tests. So our tests are do an action and then call an assert. And typically the assert is like asking the page object, hey, is this visible? So the page object knows how to tell if the dialog's popped up on top of it, and then you assert that it did pop up. So, go ahead.
Sorry, I have a last question.
Yeah, you're good.
What's the coupling between your user object and your page object? Pass the user in.
We pass the user in. It's we do it all implicitly in Scala. So you create an implicit user at the top of the test, and all the page objects expect to have a user. And our user also, because of that, and having to, similar with the driver, you're going to need the driver and all the page objects. We do the same thing. The driver and the user, we just wrap into like a coupled object, and that's the implicit object we pass around to everything, a driver and a user. So, go ahead.
I'm the one teaching the Saturday class.
Okay.
I actually have done some stuff with inversion control, so you're not passing that driver around. I'm going to hit up on that. So it's pretty awesome.
Sounds good. I'm looking forward to that. That's something we need. Are there any other questions, comments?
Do you guys use any other testing suites, like headless testers or anything?
We've started experimenting a little bit with it. We have we have about 80% of our code is JavaScript on the front end. Like I said, we do all our own rendering and a lot of stuff. And we've found we're actively looking at it, but trying to figure out the issues when we run these same tests in headless browsers. Try and figure out, oh, hey, this one started failing. It fails headless. It doesn't fail when we're running with a full browser. What's the difference? What are we doing here? And trying to make the test. So it is a direction we're trying to move. We think it would make it much faster, but yeah.
We at Bluehost we use Casper.js.
Yeah.
It's substantially faster than the selection test that I've written. So.
Yeah. So it's one of those things that we're moving towards. We want to get there, but we're back at like about that 20% failure rate when we run them all headless, and trying to work that back down. So.
Clarify the term headless. So what I do in my tests, again, you can call it headless. I just set up an X frame buffer, a null frame buffer, and send the output of the browser to that buffer, and so it doesn't actually have to do window rendering.
Yeah.
Is that what you mean by headless, or is it something else?
Headless, I think, like the tool we've used trying to do headless was also Casper.js. So just.
It doesn't spin up an actual browser. It spins up its own. So it's just manipulating the DOM.
Okay, I just have it set up manually.
Yeah, same sort of thing set up manually. Yep, same sort of idea. So. Any other questions? Okay. Scala. So all our tests are written in Scala. It has a little functional aspects on top of the JVM. So. Yep. Well, thank you all for coming. If you have any other questions, you can come up and talk to me afterwards.